Okay, good morning everybody, and thank you Hans and our Turkish host for having me and having us here. Great pleasure and an honor as well. We have to talk about corruption this morning, and the way I want to present it to you is twofold actually. I'm going to divide my presentation into two sections. The first section is very quick and a little boring, I ask you for forgiveness. It's about definitions. Then I'll go quickly into the literature, and then perhaps the most exciting side is going to be what can we do, what can we learn, and what can we propose in order to have, I wouldn't say a new vision, but a new way to look at the data and the factual evidence regarding corruption. Now, when it comes to definitions, so the first problem is that the standard literature usually looks at corruption in two ways, which are basically the same thing. One, they define corruption as bribing public officials. The underlying assumption is that what they would do without corrupting practices would be perfect, basically. So anything which interferes with a perfect bureaucrat is necessarily bad. The second thing is that the bureaucrat can be, the second way to look at it is that the bureaucrat can be bad, and therefore he uses his own public office for private gains. Once again, the basic notion is that you have a deal between a private agent and a public agent, whereby the public agent really breaks the rules of the game by looking for money, which is accepted, and therefore the legal framework is being approached upon. Once again, the underlying assumption is that the underlying legal framework is more or less sufficient, optimal, wonderful, perfect, flawless, whatever. There are a number of problems with these definitions. I've already mentioned one, that is the perfection assumption behind it, and this is by no means guaranteed. Second thing is that corruption is by no means exclusive to the public sector. It's not restricted to the public sector. You can have, surely, interaction between the private and the public sector, which is what people usually look at, but you can also have corruption among private entities. Something we're not going to look at. We're not going to analyze today for a reason I'm going to tell you right now. We can have corruption also among state officials. You don't really have only the state. You have various layers in the state system. You have bureaucrats and various layers within the bureaucratic system, and you have politicians. And sometimes politicians are not at the same time the same thing as bureaucrats. And you can also have interactions, deals between politicians on one hand and bureaucrats on the other hand. The reason why I'm not going to look into private deals is that that's not a particularly problematic question. It is when you have a manager in a private company, a corrupt manager in a private company, what he's actually doing is breaking a contract between the shareholder and himself, and therefore it really becomes fraud. It's not a big issue. And the market will take care of that. It is, I'm not saying that in the private world corruption is absent. What I'm saying is that if you overdo it, a less corrupted company will drive you out of business, and therefore there is a limit to corruption. And the limit to corruption is going to be lower the lower the normative barriers to entry. So basically competition will take care of corruption. I'm not saying that corruption will be driven to zero, I'm just saying that it will be kept within limits. When you have normative issues, then corruption then goes sky high, obviously, because there are no forces that spontaneously, quote unquote, would restrain him. So I'm leaving private to private stories aside. The other thing which the standard definition has problems with is that it does not clarify the distinction between legality and legitimacy. That is, there are situations where you have corrupt practices that are not classified as corrupt practices because they are compliant with the law. That is, if you have the legislature passing the law, which is the outcome of corrupt practices, that doesn't show up in the statistics because, after all, what happens later is compliant with the law. That doesn't mean that you have legitimate practice. It just means that you have legal procedures. So the standard definition doesn't make the distinction between legal and legitimate practices, which is a kind of a substantial story because corruption really includes both areas of analysis. The third or fourth shortcoming of the standard definition is that corruption excludes many sorts of illegal practices that have different economic implications. That is, for instance, rent-seeking is the main issue at stake. And if you do not consider corruption at the same time as rent-seeking, you get what statisticians would call spurious correlation problems, and therefore your statistical results will be flawed. In my view, a better definition, which is seldom found in the literature, is looking at corruption as a result of a principal-agent problem. That is, a situation where the agent breaks a contract with the principal by dealing with a third party. In particular, you have a situation where an agent receives a reward from a third party, and he receives that reward when dealing with a third party, and the deal is at least partially also the deal he has with the principal. So you just have one borderline case, which is nepotism, of course. That is, what is the reward of nepotism? Family ties, perhaps long-term family solidarity, but that's really a minor story. But what I would like you to think about is the principal-agent problem, because this is what is going to drive you and drive us through the next 20 minutes or so. Morality is the other story. I'm not going to look too much into legal aspects because I'm not interested. It is the legal aspect. If you have a principal-agent contract and the legal aspect, which is legally valid, for instance, look at what happens in many regulatory issues. Corruption is always there because you have a rule which is legally being issued because parliament, government, bureaucrats have the power to put a stamp, say it's legal, then whatever goes against the legal question and has monetary transfers involved is going to be corruption. But that's not the point. The more relevant point from an analytical standpoint is the moral question. And of course, morality ultimately depends on our notion of freedom. So, as libertarians, the notion of freedom is a question of freedom from coercion. But if you're a mainstream analyst, you might have other notions of freedom in mind, say freedom from need, freedom to contribute to the common good, freedom to comply with what government or parties or legislature claim. So morality is a tricky issue there. What we would say is that if a principal-agent contract is immoral, because, for instance, we never signed the Constitution, because we never went to vote, and therefore we never gave our consent to any kind of social contract, then whatever the principal-agent contract is about has no moral force, therefore there is no moral, so there is no, say, contract infringement or contract breakdown. What is more relevant, so this is end of the first part, but the basic point of my first part is that definitions are kind of fussy and hazy and bad for two reasons. A, they do not focus on the moral issue, the notion of the moral content of the principal agent contract regarding the state on the one hand, politicians and bureaucrats and individuals, and B, the standard definition forgets about, really is barking their own tree because they make it a question of legality, and legality is an arbitrary notion. So corruption also becomes an arbitrary notion. So you will go nowhere. Let's look at the figures. The standard literature looks at one set of figures only. That is, they have one aim. And the aim is to evaluate the consequences of corruption on GDP. It could be GDP levels, most of the time. Sometimes they analyze GDP growth rates, and they carry out more or less sophisticated econometric exercises trying to find a correlation between corruption on the one hand, GDP or GDP growth on the other hand. Unfortunately, other goals are totally ignored. I'm going to ignore them too, but just for you to know what other goals could be, you could have social goals, for instance, redistribution, income equality. People who might appreciate redistribution might think that redistribution through corruption is better than redistribution through other means. This is totally absent in the literature. Political stability, political accountability, which I'm going to ignore, is equally ignored by the literature. The difference is that I know I'm going to do it, and I apologize for that, the others don't. Basically, you might have situations, think of totalitarian countries, where you want to have bribes because otherwise you have no accountability by bureaucrats at all levels. Therefore, you are willing to exchange rent-seeking against tax or an accountability which does not rule out rent-seeking on a much larger scale. So the standard literature claims that corruption is usually bad because it is illegal, which is some kind of definition, and because it is morally bad since it reflects existence or creates dishonest agents, bureaucrats, but not only bureaucrats. As if bureaucrats without corruption were perfect, honest, and clean, and welfare-loving people. Well, welfare, other people's welfare-loving people. They have, of course. There are exceptions accepted in the literature, and the exceptions are corruption is good, or at least tolerable, if it reduces transaction costs. That is, if it is a way to circumvent bad laws and bad policy making. So the idea is that you have bad policy making, corruption is a way to reduce the cost of those bad laws, and therefore can be acceptable. It is a second best solution, of course, in this case. Therefore, you have a wide range of statistical results, and with this I come to the very recent literature. And you have basically, it depends on the articles you're looking at, you have people who carry out exercises and come out with the result that in low-income countries with little economic freedom, corruption is bad. The idea is that if you have little economic freedom, the reward to corruption is low, therefore corruption absorbs scarce resources in activities that give you very little benefits. I repeat, the idea is if you have little economic freedom, you don't have many opportunities. That is, either you drink this bottle of water or you have no water. So corrupting people in order to have this bottle of water does not improve the situation, because you don't have a chance to choose among many bottles of water. So corruption absorbs resources into an activity that does not open up the spectrum, the range of the entrepreneurial activities into which you might engage. So I repeat, when you have little economic freedom, you have low income, and when you have little economic freedom, it means that you don't have opportunities to allocate the resources in more effective ways. Therefore, corruption is just a dead weight loss. The alternative is that people say, no, this is another range of statistical results you get from literature. No, they say in low-income countries, corruption is good, because in low-income, the problem with low-income countries is they have very bad lawmaking. Therefore, if you carry out corrupt practices, you can avoid the consequences of the law, and therefore you can do better things than what the law would force you to do. So the difference is that in one case, you define or you believe that low income is generated by little economic freedom. In the other case, you focus on the institutional context. Basically, you say we have a bad institutional context, and the content is badly specified, unfortunately. It is not quite the same. In this literature, economic freedom and bad institutional context is not the same thing. In one case, lack of economic freedom means lack of alternative. In the other context, bad institutional context means bad laws. So, it depends on which issue you emphasize in your models, in your econometric regressions, and you have different results. In one case, corruption is good. In the other case, corruption is bad. The opposite applies to high-income countries. That is, if by corrupting officials you have access to superior, to better allocation of resources, then corruption is good. If by corrupting officials you misallocate resources, then corruption is bad. In general, but it's just in general, it is assumed that in developed countries corruption is bad, because the idea is if the country is developed, it means that lawmaking is good. Therefore, all attempts to interfere with current legal context are going to affect efficiency, therefore it's going to be bad. A minority of the authors, they claim that it can be good, because in high developed countries you have a lot of economic freedom, which means that you have a wide range of alternatives. Therefore, by going through corruption, you open up this latent range of alternatives which you could exploit in your entrepreneurial engagements. So, once again, there is an ambiguity in the definitions, and as a result, you have an ambiguity in the results. If you look at the last issue, one issue, of the Cato Journal, you have two articles on corruption, one next to the other, and they have opposite results. And they both come up at the end of very complex econometric estimates. But the main difference between them is that they look at corruption by emphasizing two different notions of corruption and two different institutional contexts. In fact, the problem is that you have to decide, you have to make up your mind whether you're emphasizing the rent-seeking component in the corruption phenomenon or the law enforcement component. If you emphasize the rent-seeking story, that is, when the principal agent contract I referred to is about rent-seeking, then corruption might reduce expensive rent-seeking and replace it with cheaper rent-seeking. If that is the case, then corruption is good. So I repeat, suppose that we are starting from a situation where rent-seeking is pervasive, and rent-seeking is big-scale rent-seeking. Then corruption is a way to reduce those rents by having more efficient entrants driving out of the market less efficient rent seekers. If that is the case, then the amount of rent seeking in the economy drops, and therefore the environment improves, and therefore you can have better results in terms of GDP. However, when the principal agent contract is about efficiency, that is, you believe that you don't have rent seeking, or you believe that you originally have a low level of rent seeking, then corruption is bad. So, because you introduce extra costs and extra rent seeking opportunities acquired through corruption. So the basic issue is that you have to tell me before how much rent seeking you start from. And as a consequence of your rent seeking environment, before the corruption exercise takes place, then I tell you the results of corruption. The other possibility is to look at the law enforcement component. And the idea is that if law enforcement is bad, the agent can't perform, then the enforcers have to be bribed. In this case, corruption enhances to improve the rule of law. Rule of law really means property right protection and contract enforcement. In that case, corruption can be beneficial. If the principal agent contract is loosely defined, once again, corruption defines the rules of the game that the legislature has not defined, and therefore it gives reference points to operators, and therefore corruption is good. If the principal agent contract is well specified and law enforcement is the issue, then corruption is again bad because it alters the original contract. Once again, tell me what your assumptions regarding law enforcement are, and I'll tell you whether corruption can be beneficial or disruptive. So basically, the confusion in the current literature, in my view, is due to the confusion on the notion of corruption, because they put together these two notions, one emphasizing rent seeking, the other emphasizing law enforcement, and then depending upon which side you want to investigate, you have different results. The fact that you call the two phenomena in the same way, of course, adds to the confusion. I suggest a different way to look at the whole issue by trying to take into account this rent-seeking story. And my suggestion is to define corruption in two different stages. We can call it first-degree corruption and second-degree corruption. You can have first-degree corruption when the legislature, that is, the political body, is involved. That is, you have on the one hand top politicians and bureaucrats, on the other hand you can have other top politicians and bureaucrats or companies or interest groups. Basically, this is legal corruption because you just ask the politicians to do something legally, that is, to give you grants. But it is legal because, after all, it goes through Parliament. You don't have to pay these guys, incidentally. You just have to make sure that they get the votes, and you don't have necessarily to pay them to persuade them that by doing A rather than B, they're going to win the next elections. Then you have second-degree corruption, which is when smaller scale corruption is involved. That is, minor players are in the game. And minor players means, say, small companies, individuals, low-rank bureaucrats. Now, let's take advantage of this distinction, first-degree and second-degree corruption, and let's see how the rent-seeking story works from this perspective. If you focus on rent-seeking, which is carried out through legislation, first example, and by far the most important example, is probably regulation. First-degree corruption, that is illegal corruption, is usually bad. As we know, regulation is bad. Even in a dynamic context, it does not improve things, because if you have a corrupt, that is a regulated industry, and you have companies that are willing to pay bribes in order to get into the industry, industry and change regulation, you do that only if you are able to increase the rents to the bureaucrats and to the politicians. So that overall, that way cost is going to increase. There are two important exceptions, though, which are very frequent. One is strategic regulation. That is, if you are a politician, you're not interested in getting the bribe right now. What you're interested in to begin with is to create a market for bribes. So you don't really care whether you regulate industry A or industry B. What you care for is to regulate something so that somebody would come up to you and offer you a bribe to do something different. Either to increase regulation, to decrease the regulation. If you decrease regulation, that doesn't make you honest. It just gives the possibility of being a free market where you take the bribe. But that is not the same thing, of course. Now, when you have strategic regulation, you set up barriers in order to create rent-seeking opportunities, and rather than create rent-seeking. In that case, corruption is good, of course, because look at the developing country. Suppose that I am the totalitarian leader of country A, and I decide to ban all kinds of foreign investments. Am I going to do that? Not stage one. But the day afterwards, somebody will come up to me and say, how much do you want in order to let me in? I tell you my price, you come in. Is it good or bad for the country? Of course it's good, because you have one more company operating in the country. And part of the profits have been taken away from the company and they go to the leader, to me, leader of country A. But overall, growth rate increases, or GDP increases, welfare of the population, whatever you want, goes up. So in this case, when you have strategic regulation to begin with, corruption comes in, then you have corruption induced by this strategic regulation. This is good. It does not appear in the statistics. That is, what appears in the statistics is a company that bribes me. But you don't have my legally corrupt practices that have been enforced when I began with my regulatory policy to begin with. So if you look at the current statistical exercises, you have biased samples because you just see one side of the picture. And if you look at just one side of the picture without taking into account the other side of the picture, you would forget about the notion of opportunity cost. And therefore, you don't know what the net results are going to be. You just see the cost, you don't see the benefits. Another possibility of beneficial corruption in first degree is when you have large differences in productivities between the incumbent rent seekers and the rivals. Which again, I can repeat my example with slightly different words and you come to the same conclusion. It's good if a good competitor comes in and gets out, well, the good rent seeker, an efficient rent seeker, is usually better than an inefficient rent seeker. The reason is that you can pay a higher bribe, so he gets in, but still creates more wealth than the inefficient incumbent rent seeker. In this framework, second-degree corruption is good if it mitigates the effects of large-scale rent seeking, that is, first-degree corruption. Once again, the statistics concentrate on second-degree rent seeking and forget about first-degree rent seeking. So, of course, if you take second-degree rent seeking on its own, small-scale bribes, you say it's bad. But if you don't compare it with the benefit, which is reducing the cost of first-degree rent seeking, then if you do that, that is, if you do the comparison, the net outcome is much less obvious, and it can actually be positive. Similar comments apply to law enforcement of poorly defined laws. So I just wrap it up to conclude. Mainstream economists got interested into corruption in the 1990s, basically because the World Bank and the IMF had found out that their development policies were a total disaster, and therefore they started to think that the usual development policies had to be revised in the light of institutional economics. Their understanding of institutional economics was, let's design perfect institutions. And the reason why we don't have successful development policies is that institutions, agencies, regulators are not perfect enough. So they say one way to make them perfect is to eradicate corruption. They run the statistics, and what do they see? They see the obvious or the obvious. That is, whenever you have bad policy making and lack of economic freedom, you name it, then economic performance is disappointing. In particular, they showed that corruption affects investment, and investment affects growth. Of course, that is theoretically weak and factually false. The reason being that corruption does not necessarily discourage investment. If you are a small entrepreneur, if you have to comply with all the regulations in place, say in Italy or in other industrialized countries, if you have to comply, you will never invest a penny. If you pay a few bribes here and there, it makes it worthwhile to invest. So in the end, you do invest rather than taking your money away or just spending it all, consumption. So factually, these were bad results. Theoretically, when we're talking about it, it doesn't make much sense either. My suggestion is that we have to, corruption is a much more articulated phenomenon, it's much more complicated. We have to look at what causes corruption, and I'll give you two ways to look at it. One is by comparing the rent-seeking story with the law enforcement story. The other key is by comparing first-degree corruption with second-degree corruption. And if you look at corruption by using one of these two keys, you see that corruption not only is a much more complex story, not only has it much wider moral implication, but it can also have quite different